Westward expansion, 1801 to 1861 and beyond. America is establishing its boundaries. So here you can see the trails moving west. So some big ideas for this flip lecture that you should pull out of this one. Between 1801 and 1861, exploration was encouraged as America underwent vast territorial expansion and settlement. And this we already know from when we were discussing sectionalism. Westward migration was influenced by geography and economic opportunity. There was this continued push, especially among white Americans, to move west. African Americans, Chinese immigrants, and Native Americans were important in westward expansion. And prior to the Civil War, most industrialization in America was in the North. However, equipment that was produced in the North did have an impact on farming society in the West and in the South. So, post-revolutionary America, just to review, this was it. This eastern seaboard as far as the Mississippi River. You had new territories that were added to the United States after 1801. The Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson bought this from France, doubled the size of the United States. Lewis and Clark went out and explored, and almost immediately people, upon their return, were heading out there. So you had this addition. Other territories, you had Florida that was ceded to the United States from Spain through a treaty. Texas was added after becoming an independent republic in the war with Mexico. Oregon Territory was divided between the United States and Great Britain. In California, the war with Mexico also resulted in a whole bunch of territory in the Southwest, including California. So Florida, Texas, Oregon, California. Maybe we should just have 6 states. There's an idea. Factors affecting westward expansion. There were geographic and economic factors that pushed people west, so there were push factors and pull factors. Population growth in the eastern states were push factors. Pull factors were the availability of cheap and fertile land. Also, economic opportunity, the gold rush, logging, farming, freedom for runaway slaves were also pull factors in the West. You had cheaper and faster transportation that allowed people to move as well as goods. And you had knowledge of these overland trails, the Oregon and Santa Fe Trail being some of them. And this idea and this belief in manifest destiny that the United States had been sort of given this country to explore and expand into. So some of the important inventions, again, review. The cotton gin really forced the increase in need of slave labor as well as more land for larger plantations. But you also had Cyrus McCormick and Joe Anderson, who was a slave, who worked to invent reapers that would increase farm productivity. Then you didn't have people out in the field with scythes slicing down crops. You could do it with a mechanical device. Other famous inventions, the steamboat invented by Robert Fulton and provided faster river transportation connecting the North in the South and the West. The steam locomotive provided faster land transportation. And then a lot of this sort of changed very instantly with the gold rush in 1849. And the gold rush started in California, but it became a silver rush and a copper boom, and it expanded all over the West, and there was literally some gold fever. It was discovered in 1849 in California, but then you later had rushes in Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Arizona. People moved west, were called miners, and then you had immigrants such as Mexicans, Chinese, and the Irish who went to work in the mines as well. These immigrants were treated poorly with long hours, lower pay than everybody else, and they got to do the most dangerous work in those locations. People were recruited to come to these mines out west. And here you can see they were sort of little mini environmental disasters as well. Initially it was just panning in creeks, but later hydraulic mining and the use of high-pressured water hoses was used to basically force the gold out of the riverbeds, and it displaced a lot of sediments and caused these tailing piles, which disrupted habitats, all kinds of awesomeness going on. Here you can see you had lots of people that were coming to work, and the Chinese also were coming and working in these areas. This is a sluice box where water was rerouted, and people would be able to stand over the box and look as the water flowed for gold and gold flakes. African Americans were also moving out west, particularly during the Reconstruction era post-Civil War. They were wanting to get far away from the plantation life. They wanted their own piece of soil. And so they were actively encouraged to move out west and homestead. And as you can see, they could do it fairly cheaply. And they were invited by these states to come and settle. They were known as exodusters. Many African Americans moved west between the 1840s and 1890s. And they were escaping life in the South. As Reconstruction came to an end, Southern whites, particularly members of the Democratic Party, found ways to restrict those laws and the rights of African Americans and former slaves in those places. So even though we passed the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction, the states themselves enforced Jim Crow laws, which denied African Americans their constitutional rights. For example, the grandfather clause was put in place, which basically said if your grandfather couldn't vote, you couldn't vote. Makes it really difficult if you're a slave or a former slave, because you likely had no relative that had been able to vote. So these folks were moving out west, seeking new economic opportunities and personal freedom. So here you have pre-Photoshop. I love that these guys have been cut and pasted in here. Take a look at that. It's pretty awesome. But they're supposedly waiting in line for a steamship that would take them likely up the Mississippi into the Platte or up into the Missouri River area and up into Montana and out west. In 1862, under the leadership of President Lincoln, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which opened up land in the West for homesteaders for very, very cheap. Basically, if you could live on it and stake your claim, find a section of land that was marked, stake your claim, you registered that piece of land with the federal government, and then you cultivated it, and you had to build a permanent structure on it. That was proving it up. And I believe in some cases that permanent structure actually had to have a window. So glass and windows were kind of a hot commodity in the Great Plains for a while. And then it was yours for free after you lived on it for approximately 5 years. Now, most of these people got out here thinking it was awesome free land, but then they quickly discovered that the land that they were getting was not suitable for farming. For example, on the plain, there were no trees to even build homes out of. So most of these folks were called sod busters because they literally hacked up the sod of the native grasses and built their homes out of them during this time period. Think about Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder, if you've ever read any of those. Her first book, as a young child, she lived in a sod house. Homesteaders moved out, and they would have these giant land rushes, and they were these races where you would go on horseback and in wagon, and you would have to go and stake your claims, and you'd put your little flags out to claim your territory. You see this mass migration of Americans moving across the plains and settling, and sometimes immigrants settling in regions. This is the era of the Conestoga Wagon, the Oregon Trail, if you ever played that game or remember Wagons Ho from when you were in elementary school. This is that time period. So here's an example of one of those land rushes in 1889. I believe this is out in Oklahoma, if I'm not mistaken. Very dusty, very little water. Ultimately, what happens out here is an ecological disaster. As we send all these farmers out there, they dig up the prairies and the plains in a place where there's very little water and really high winds. And later we'll see when we get to the Dust Bowl that this, after about 50 years of farming like this on these very arid places, that we created the Dust Bowl, and we'll get to that when we get to the Great Depression. The next thing that happened is in 1869, we have the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. You had these Central Pacific that was moving from San Francisco into Utah, and then the Union Pacific, which was coming from the middle of the country towards Utah, and they ultimately met in the middle. You had lots of immigrants that actually worked this time period as well. The Irish were working on the Union Pacific side, and the Mexicans and the Chinese were building the Central Pacific side. The Chinese were hired for their expertise in the use of gunpowder, and they did the most dangerous work of blasting through the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. They died in avalanches, they died in explosions, and they still kept coming in massive numbers. That later becomes an issue, and in fact, so many Chinese immigrants come into the United States that there is a nativist kickback, and ultimately the United States Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limits and essentially ends Chinese immigration into the United States in the late 1800s, and that Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect until the 1950s. Basically, people from China could not come to the United States until the 1950s as a result of this Chinese Exclusion Act. But here you can see the Chinese blasting through the Sierras. And again, these are folks digging out after an avalanche, trying to find their comrades. And you can see some of the tunnels. If you ever go to Truckee, you can still see these snow shed tunnels that they had to build to keep the avalanching snow off the tracks. And you can kind of go and walk through them if you want. Ultimately, in 1869, the Central Pacific meets the Union Pacific in Promontory Point, Utah, which is only about 150 miles from here. You can go and look at the Golden Spike, which they then took out and put in a glass box. So the impact of these railroads, it brought growth and new settlement all across the West. The railroads enabled people, supplies, and mail to move quickly and across the plains and the mountains. Large cities and towns were developed where railroad lines met. So people actually lobbied to have railroads put and depots put in their towns because that meant money. Because of the rapid growth of these Western territories, you saw more of these territories applying for statehood. And between 1864, Nevada, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington all became states. The lumber industry grows, which was big here in northern Idaho particularly because wood is needed to build the train tracks. The steel industry grows back east because steel is needed to build the tracks and the trains. The coal industry goes because coal is needed to fuel the train, and this opens up thousands of new jobs. So you're seeing a sort of a second industrial boom or industrial revolution in the late 1800s. The other thing that was happening is because you had these rail lines that were connecting the east and the west, you had the Great Plains were a great place to ranch and graze cattle, which then could be slaughtered in places like St. Louis and Chicago, and then shipped all over the country as meat. So you had these great cattle trails where people would winter the cattle here and summer the cattle up here on greener grass. And the Chisholm Trail was, you had a few years there in the late 1800s where cattle pretty much had free range out on the Great Plains. And this gets this idea of the cattleman's myth or the cowboy culture with long cattle drives. Unfortunately, very quickly, there was an invention of barbed wire, which really ended this shortened period of open range. People started setting up the barbed wire, claiming their cows, branding their cows, and you no longer saw these free range cows and the cowboys just wandering the plains anymore. So the Army took an active role out west as well, and I think we'll stop here and I'll pick that up in a minute with part 2.